Ever find yourself thinking, how solid is this advice, really? Like when you come across those tips for learning something new or boosting productivity, and you're left wondering where it all came from.
Oh, absolutely. We're bombarded with recommendations these days, and it's hard to know what to trust.
Right. So that's exactly what we're diving into today on the deep dive. We're going behind the scenes to see how research, especially in fields like education and psychology, turns into practical advice you can actually rely on.
Sounds intriguing.
And to guide us, we have this fantastic article by Shraw and Patel, using principles of evidence-based practice to improve prescriptive recommendations.
Ah, Shra and Patel, a classic. They really get into this tension between individual research studies and the recommendations that sometimes spring up, maybe a little prematurely, based on them.
Exactly. You see an interesting study, and suddenly, boom, everyone's talking about a new proven method. But our mission today is to understand the full journey, the rigorous process that should be happening before we turn research findings into trustworthy guidance.
Because, let's be honest, basing a recommendation on just one study can be a bit shaky, right?
Totally. It's like building a house on one brick. So let's talk about this concern with single studies. Why is it potentially risky to base broad recommendations on just one piece of research?
Well, you have to remember the nature of a single study. It's usually very focused, as Robinson and his colleagues pointed out in 2013, looking at a specific question with a specific group of people in a controlled setting.
Right, so very controlled circumstances.
Yes, and that's great for internal validity, making sure the findings within that study are solid. But, and here's the catch, it means those findings might not apply to everyone else in every situation. It's a very narrow lens.
Like looking at one tree in a vast forest.
Right, precisely. You get a detailed view of that one tree, but you don't know what the rest of the forest looks like. Now, on top of that, as Hedges explains, even the effects you see in that single study, how much something works, for instance, might not be super reliable. Every study has its own quirks, and trying to generalize from one to the whole wide world. Well, it's tricky. What works in a lab might not work in your classroom or your home.
Makes total sense. I've fallen into that trap myself, trying some proven technique from an article only to find it completely flopped for me.
Oh, we've all been there.
Yeah.
It's so tempting to grab onto that one promising study. But there's a nuance here that Vaughn and Fuchs bring up. They suggest that if you're dealing with a really urgent problem and you just don't have the time or resources to wait for more research, maybe, just maybe, a recommendation from a single, very high-quality study could be okay as a temporary measure.
So like an emergency situation where you use the best information you had at that moment.
Yeah, something like that. But they're very clear. Those recommendations come with a huge disclaimer. They should be super tentative, only applied to the exact situation studied, not a free pass to make sweeping statements.
Right, so a single study might give us clues, but it's definitely not the final word on what works. What's the more robust, reliable approach?
That's where evidence-based practice, or EBP, comes in.
Okay, EBP, tell me more.
Think of EBP as a journey, not a sprint. It's a multi-step process, as described by Cho, Jensen, and others, carefully designed to give us much more confidence in the recommendations that come out at the end.
Okay, a multi-step journey. I like the sound of that. Take us through those steps.
So first, we need to generate that solid research data, the building blocks. Individual researchers conduct those studies. Those findings get published in journals. Think of it as gathering all the pieces of a puzzle.
You need those initial pieces to work with, right?
Absolutely. Then comes the magic of research synthesis. This is where the picture starts to come together. Instead of looking at each study in isolation, you combine the findings from multiple studies that looked at similar questions.
Ah, so you're looking for those consistent patterns across a whole body of research, not just one snapshot.
Precisely. And that takes us to step 3, where we summarize all that combined data into practical, evidence-based strategies. But this isn't just about crunching numbers in a vacuum. It's about having those crucial conversations with policymakers, practitioners, experts from different fields, what we call multi-stakeholder evaluation.
Oh, I like that. So it's not just researchers in a lab deciding what works, but a real conversation with the people who will actually be using this advice.
Exactly. And Carey, Chorpita, Cho, they all highlight how important this collaborative stage is.
Yeah.
Then finally, step 4 brings us to the real world, where we have thorough consultations with stakeholders as we select and implement those strategies for specific situations, tailoring them to fit. As DeZos points out, it's all about fitting the advice to the unique context where it's being used.
So gather the evidence, synthesize it, get everyone talking, then adapt to the real world. Sounds way more robust than just jumping from a single study to a recommendation.
You got it. And as Schra and Patel emphasize, good practice usually emerges from this careful synthesis of findings across multiple studies, not from one single research paper.
You mentioned this idea of aggregated data and meta-analysis, which is part of that synthesis process, right? Why is combining the results of multiple studies so powerful?
It's all about getting a clearer, more reliable picture. Hedges explains it beautifully. When you combine results from several well-designed studies looking at the same question, you average out the noise, the random variations that might be present in any single study.
Like getting a stronger signal by reducing the static.
Exactly. And Cooper and his colleagues have shown that meta-analysis can even reveal things you wouldn't see in individual studies, like how certain factors might influence the effectiveness of an intervention age of the participants, the setting, those subtle nuances.
Fascinating. But you also mentioned that meta-analysis has its challenges. What are some potential pitfalls?
Well, as Hedges, Jensen, and Dozoa all discuss, one of the biggest challenges is dealing with the variability between studies. Different methods, different populations, different ways of measuring things. If you're not careful, combining those apples and oranges can give you a misleading result.
So like averaging your grocery bill with your rent payment, not very helpful.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, Rubin and Parrish found that in some meta-analyses, less than half the studies used had really strong methodology. You can't magically turn weak studies into a strong conclusion, right? It's garbage in, garbage out.
Makes sense. So how do researchers try to ensure that meta-analyses are as reliable as possible given these challenges?
It's all about being rigorous and transparent. Cooper and others have outlined some great strategies. For example, having multiple researchers agree on which studies to include and how to interpret them helps to minimize individual bias. You also want to statistically account for those differences in study design. How much is that variation affecting the results? And defining everything clearly, making sure everyone's talking about the same thing. Plus, looking at those meta-analysis findings within the bigger picture. How do they fit with existing theories and other research?
So a lot of checks and balances.
Absolutely. And Chow even provides these really detailed criteria for judging the quality of aggregated data, while Cooper has 20 questions to ask about the validity of a research synthesis. Really helpful resources for anyone wanting to dive deeper.
Wow, that's impressive. But even with all those checks, turning this synthesized data into actual advice for people, that seems like another tricky step.
Oh, it definitely is. Chow talks about this gap between having the results of a meta-analysis and knowing what a clinician or a teacher should actually do differently. He suggests practitioners ask themselves three things. First, how well do these findings really apply to my specific situation? Are the people and the context similar enough? Second, how will I know if it's working? How do I measure effectiveness and cost benefit? And third, what are my specific goals? What outcomes am I aiming for?
So a teacher shouldn't just read a meta-analysis and overhaul their entire classroom without thinking about their specific students.
Exactly. A one-size-fits-all approach rarely works. And remember, Schra and Patel are clear that simply summarizing research isn't enough for making recommendations for policy or widespread practice. You need those practitioners, those policymakers, those experts on the ground to bridge the gap between research and reality. As Wecker says, it's about making it relevant and applicable.
Which brings us to the crucial step of implementing those findings in the real world and getting everyone on board that stakeholder buy-in.
Right. And this is where things can get really tricky. Carrie and her colleagues lay out this three-phase implementation process. First, identify the best practices based on the evidence. Second, develop a plan for putting them into action. And third, pilot test that plan in real-world settings. But the success of the whole thing depends on whether those practices can actually be implemented well.
Because if the teachers or therapists, whoever's using these recommendations, don't get it or don't buy into it, it's not going to work.
Exactly. And both Sherlock and Hemsley, Brown, and Sharp point out this potential value gap between researchers and practitioners. Researchers often focus on methodological rigor, while practitioners might prioritize things like practicality and feasibility. Getting everyone on the same page requires clear communication, showing the real-world benefits, and getting that buy-in.
You mentioned some strategies for navigating those differences, right? Relevance mapping and weight of evidence risk assessment.
Yes. These are fantastic tools developed by Chorpita and Linkoff and their colleagues. Relevance mapping helps you systematically compare different interventions and choose the best fit for your context and goals. Weight of evidence risk assessment is a structured way to consider multiple types of evidence, both the hard data and the qualitative insights, and make decisions collaboratively, making those different perspectives and uncertainties more transparent.
So to recap, Shravan Patel, drawing on stains, laid out that four-step sequence from research to practice. What are those key steps again, and where are the potential trouble spots?
Step 1. You generate that initial valid data through research, published in journals. Step 2. You synthesize that data, combining findings from multiple studies. Step 3. You summarize that aggregated data into practical strategies, but remember this involves those vital policy discussions and stakeholder input. And Step 4. You consult thoroughly with stakeholders as you implement and adapt those strategies in specific real-world situations. And those fracture points, as Jensen and Hemsley Brown and Sharp call them, often pop up during data synthesis when experts might disagree, and again when trying to get buy-in from practitioners during implementation. Managing those differences, both in the research findings and in people's values, is key.
This all highlights why we shouldn't just rely on individual research articles for practical recommendations.
Exactly. Integrative reviews, those that blend synthesized research with stakeholder input, are really the gold standard for making evidence-based practice recommendations, as Schra and Vitale argue. And while you might see a meta-analysis in a research journal, their main purpose usually isn't to inform those broader policy discussions about evidence-based practices, which are so crucial for that third step in the sequence.
So let's come full circle. When, if ever, is it okay to make recommendations based on a single study?
Hedges and Robinson and their colleagues are pretty clear we should be very cautious about recommendations based on just one study, even if it seems groundbreaking. There are limitations in how reliable those results are and how broadly they apply, but Vaughan and Fuchs and Wecker acknowledge that in rare situations like facing an urgent problem where there's just no time for a full synthesis, a tentative recommendation from a single, exceptionally strong study might be a starting point, but with huge caveats.
Huge caveats, I like that.
It has to be very, very specific to the intervention, the population, the context studied. It's a temporary Band-Aid, not a long-term solution.
So, the big takeaway. Turning research into reliable, practical advice is a complex, multi-layered process. It's about building a body of evidence, evaluating it carefully, and collaborating to make it work in the real world.
Absolutely. And understanding this process, you, our listener, can be a more critical consumer of information. When you encounter a recommendation, ask yourself, single study or a synthesis? Were practitioners involved? Was it tested in the real world?
That's so empowering. It gives us a framework for evaluating all the advice we encounter, not just taking things at face value. So for a final thought, think about the last piece of advice you received, maybe for improving sleep, learning something new, anything. What kind of evidence was it based on? A personal anecdote, a single study, something more comprehensive? And considering what we've discussed, what are the potential strengths and limitations of that evidence? Understanding how knowledge becomes practice really helps us all be more informed and discerning. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.